My name is Ing, and I am the founder and the CEO of Pray Shadows. Pray Shadows Art Gallery is a space in Brookline, Massachusetts that opened in December. And we are here to exhibit contemporary art by emerging artists and mid-career artists and artists from Boston and all over the country and all over the world. I'm really honored today to be able to present the show by Duke Riley, Lovers, Muggers, and Thieves, which is going to be on view through March 7th. And Duke and I have known each other for more than 15 years in New York. And it was always fun because we were both Boston kids who lived in New York. And 2 years ago, I moved back to Boston and I convinced him to come along for a little bit. So we're gonna have a great talk tonight where the wonderful and brilliant Jen Mergel is going to moderate a talk with Duke. We're gonna learn so much. I know a lot of people are trickling in. We had about 150 people registered for this talk, which is bananas. It's really, really amazing. And I think it's a testament to how excited people are to first of all, see art and talk about art, but also to see Duke and his presentation, which is very Boston and New England specific in a lot of ways. I want to do one plug first, which is that we are selling these t-shirts, Lovers, Muggers, and Thieves, which Duke designed in the Boston Red Sox font, he wants me to tell you. And they are being sold on our website. Haley has put the link up there. So please buy them now because some sizes are already sold out online. And we have some in the gallery as well. So you should definitely come through and buy some here. 10% of the proceeds is going to the Pine Street Inn, which is Boston and New England's largest homeless service provider. So I'm gonna get out of this chair and then have Duke sit in this chair. And Jen is going to continue this talk. And if you have any questions, put it in the chat and we will try and get to as much as possible. But Duke Riley.
Thank you, Ing. And hey, Duke.
I gotta move my tape. Hold on a second.
Okay, yes. Well, while you're getting your tape set up, I just want to say thank you to Ing and to Praise Shadows Art Gallery for the invitation to talk with you. It's been a pleasure to chat over the last few weeks, and I especially feel privileged because both you and I share history of being born and raised and growing up in this complicated city, and also in terms of having a love for a place, which means you also have a critical eye on it to help it get better. And I'm really excited to walk us through about 3 or 4 bodies of work tonight that relate to what's on view in the gallery. And yeah, just talk about, that idea of the unsung hero, talk about untold stories, what is or is not true, or a mythology, what stands. And I do just want to put a timestamp on this conversation and, move us forward, that we do have, unfortunately, a Senate resolution and House resolution just passed. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who spews crazy claims and assumptions about who has a right to be where and why, is just reprimanded by the House of Representatives. And I feel like one of the things that will be a through line for our conversation tonight, Duke, is just the idea of even Black and white claims to spaces and acknowledging what is contested, what's porous, what's more transient. And I think your work operates beautifully in that kind of gray area or that fluid area. And so I bet we're going to touch on a bunch of that. I'm just going to ask you to tell folks what a transgression line is, and want to start off our conversation with an acknowledgement. But can you say hello and teach us a little bit about this line?
Sure. I mean, were you going to do the acknowledgement first?
I'll do it right after you tell us what this is.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I think hold on, I gotta move this thing up here. I don't like to look at myself when I'm doing this. Yeah, I mean, I think that that transgression line, like the, I think people typically think of the word transgression by its, most common definition, but it also refers to the line along the beach that, is usually like where the flotsam and jetsam collects within the seaweed and whatnot, that is basically the separation point, like the high tide line. And that has always been kind of a fascinating area to me. It's specifically how it works legally, because it's one side of the the side closest to the water, which is below the high tide line, is still basically is public space, and anything on the other side of that is on a different jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So like that was like one thing when I was like a kid, and I was I spent a lot of time with my grandmother on the Cape as a kid, and hanging out along the edge of the water, and like one side anybody could be, if you wanted to go clamming and dig up the whole beach and do whatever, you could do that, and nobody could stop you from doing that. And then the other side could be private property. And the thing is that line shifts twice a day. And so this idea of like a border that has legal implications is constantly shifting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when we were talking in advance of today, we talked about how it was that the idea of owning land is a relatively young idea, right? Compared to the millennia that people have existed on the planet. And especially here, we wanted to acknowledge where we were doing this talk from in relation to that and out of respect for that. So I'm a little bit south of where Duke and Ing are right now, but all of us are speaking from the unceded territory of the Massachusetts people, which also is a throughway for both the Wampanoag to the south, closer to where I am, as well as the Nipmuc along the waterways to the north. So wanted to acknowledge the space that we're on as we then embark on this conversation about, tropes and forms of colonialist history, and how Duke is kind of taking a side-eye glance at that, and sort of using the forms to also then critique a lot of the underlying structures. So I do feel like I wanted to start off with like the way that you're indicting a lot of the hubris around, this idea of ownership, even capitalist systems, who can do what, power of production, with a very specific aesthetic. And you've started this series, which is a massive series. We conquered 5 oceans and 7 seas. And, you have all of this detritus where you're spending time on the waterways in New York, collecting them off the shorelines, and then making them into very specific portraits and images. And I'm wondering, I'll give people just background of like how you've been working on this for a while and how much you've been doing. But tell us a little bit about this project, which I'll just give a plug, will be, featured in 2022 in a major New York institution in the period rooms, across the period rooms of this institution. But it's an expansive project, and then it relates to the projects that's on view in the gallery. What inspired this, Duke?
Well, I mean, I think, I guess like I've been referencing, making things that were based on scrimshaw and maritime folk art for a long time in my practice and whatnot. But I think, specifically at some point I started looking, kind of going back to what we were talking about before with the transgression line. I mean, at some point you're watching that space over years, and now of course it's filled with plastic trash that didn't used to be there. I guess at some point I was sort of thinking about that, and thinking about the whaling industry and how that sort of was like the fossil fuel of its time, and that a lot of the imagery that, I've been studying for years and years on some of these pieces and whatnot is often like these ship owners and whaling captains and that were sort of celebrated during that time period, and we're also possibly wittingly or unwittingly completely wiping out an entire genus of animals from the face of this earth. And then of course that was eventually replaced by fossil fuel. So that, I mean, the items that were made out of baleen were the equivalent of petroleum-based plastics and things of that time, as was the fuel, the equivalent of petroleum fuel now. And so then I just started at some point drawing up these scrimshaw pieces where I started researching about who all the kind of worst culprits and responsible for all the plastic in the ocean. And it kind of really only came down to about 50 or so people that were CEOs and lobbyists and so on and so forth. Because I guess, maybe I'm going off on too much of a tangent, but I sort of always, you're sort of thinking about this problem, you hear about it, you kind of, it's kind of hard to pay attention to. You're sort of also trying to deal with it, and maybe but you're gonna sort of fuck it up anyways, because you're gonna get on a plane, they're gonna take your water bottle away, you're gonna make you dump out your water, you're gonna get thirsty, and the next thing you know, you're holding another plastic bottle and stuff. So it's a lot of burden to put on the entire, on all of us, when it's you can actually sort of focus it down to these 50 people that are actually really making it happen. And so then I started thinking about that and the relationship between that past and what's happening now, and then making these sort of scrimshaw objects that had a lot of these guys in place of the previous, the ship owners and whaling captains of that era.
Of your
Yeah.
So I have Dirk Van de Putte here, and I never knew who Dirk Van de Putte was until through your project I looked him up. But what I hear from what you're saying is,
I actually don't remember who he is, because what did he do again?
he was the CEO of Mondelez, which is basically all snack foods like Oreos and
Yeah.
any plastic candy, right? So all of those wrappers. But what I hear you saying is, if we root out the source, then we might have a fighting chance. But how is it that you can actually find a way to put in front of people's minds, or to even stimulate them looking at these things?
Yeah, I mean, naturally, I'm not trying to say that people shouldn't continue to, recycle and prevent using single-use plastic, but yeah.
But it's a fascinating history of the art form. And we had been talking about how, I show this image here, this is from the Azores, right? There's a museum of scrimshaw on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And then there is a scrimshaw piece in the Boston MFA collection, but originally from San Francisco, so from the Pacific Ocean, right? And so it's an art form that does sort of cross a number of national boundaries, because nautical history, the oceans took you where they took you. But you also are playing with conventions of display, and how it is that you think about the patterns, how it is you think about the history of maritime art when it comes to these. And you have a huge inventory of these patterns that you've collected over time. This is Ing's hand in your studio, looking through your inventory. But what is it that you've been looking at over the years, and what patterns are you grabbing? Where are these coming from?
I mean, I guess, as I've just been going around, the world, really just doing different art projects and whatnot, I always try to, visit the Maritime Museum in that city, or, and just everywhere. I'm just always have been for years and years copying down all of those patterns and kind of logging them and whatnot. But yeah, and I mean, I think that's the thing about that, that's also interesting to me about that particular time, was that it was sort of it was kind of you know, almost like this point in time where you had this huge cross-cultural communication, but at a much you know, lower level in society that had ever happened before. Whereas, you know, there were always like, you know, cultural exchange in the past, but usually it was only of like a much higher class. And then there were people on these whaling ships that were, as they were traveling around the world, they, either because people would die or, you know, would get, you know, run off or whatnot. They were constantly picking up new people and whatnot. So there was like a very multicultural experience. And then all of these different patterns were taken from, you know, all different cultures in the world, and, you know, people copied them and, you know, and traded them and whatnot. So there's sort of like all these different, yeah, that kind of thing is sort of, yeah, it's sort of like the, you know, the,
it's like a crazy quilt
yeah,
of culture.
you know, yeah, I mean, I think probably up until the internet or something, it maybe been like, you know, at that point it was like where people that probably would have never ever actually come in contact with each other were having these cultural exchanges of, you know, like that.
Well,
you know, not only with you know, that I think that's true with like sea shanties and stuff too, where there was like this combination of all these different types of music from around the world that were making up like the music that people were, you know, making on boats and whatnot too. You know?
Yeah, we were exchanging about the weird shanty phenomenon on TikTok, and some of it's New Zealand and some of it's Welsh and some of it's from, you know, the Caribbean. I'm just going to highlight here that like some of the collections on view, you know, you've got this weird like plastic scrub brush and then a bottle that's David Perdue, like, yes, the David Perdue, the, you know, former Georgian senator, like, you know, accused of insider trading in his power position, but also a CEO of Reebok and Pillowtex and all of these other, you know, production companies. And you have like this beautiful leaf pattern around his head, and something that could look Dutch next to it with something that could look, you know, like ECAT underneath it. And so it's an interesting combination of artifacts. You know, also, you know, the idea of forever is one that you kind of hammer on home. But, you know, I'm also going to look to this piece. The flip flop is in the show. And of course, you've got everything lined in mahogany and with the navy blue, you know, backgrounds behind glass, just like the museum in the Azores. Talk a little bit about, you know, how it is that you pull language out or quotes or little phrases to put in these pieces.
As far as, well, I mean, I think, I mean, a lot of the dates and different things that, yeah, like a piece that you showed before with the forever and then like 1965. I mean, a lot of those dates are referencing like specific things that might have actually happened with either legislation regarding the environment or, you know, or even just the, you know, an invention of a certain thing like the, you know, like a plastic bag or a type of material used for single-use plastic and whatnot. And then I guess the, you know, I mean, obviously to the last, I grapple with the, you know, is from Moby Dick, and, you know, and that's like that kind of, you know, thing that with, towards the end with Ahab, you know, sort of expressing that he's, you know, going to fight this fight till the death, basically, right? And then I think, you know, or sort of that particular struggle. Yeah, and I guess I was just taking that one and sort of like thinking about it in maybe almost like in the whale's perspective or something in relationship to the, you know, the ocean kind of, you know, slowly being destroyed, and this other kind of, you know, looking at, you know, the last or the end, and, you know, grappling with this, you know, this destruction, I guess.
Yeah. I mean,
really that, you know.
I think it's an amazing object. It's like an absurd object, right? We talked about like it's a flip flop. You know, it's it's one of these things we now know, the PBS special we were emailing about today, like the plastic problem, that the tonnage of plastic is soon going to supersede the biomass, like in the ocean. It's sort of insane. But
his little brother was just in here, and he was checking out the show, and he's like, I would buy that, but I'd need to have like the left foot too, because like I'm gonna wear him around with just one. And I was like, man, you are a smart kid.
yeah, but it's sort of it's the type of object that's approachable, that you can have humor about, and yet it's also helping us face this thing that otherwise we'd be tearing our hair out and we wouldn't know how to address it. And so it's an interesting kind of rhetorical device or technique. You're kind of putting it forward in a way that lets people appreciate the craft, appreciate the history, and yet you're inverting, hey, like this is also something that we need to take seriously. You use more humor in this other project that's also in the gallery, but to the same end, where you've been collecting lots of colorful plastic, like even in the piece in the gallery, I saw parts of scissors. I saw, I don't know if that was like a kazoo or something, but all sorts of crazy pieces of plastic that you found, turning them into lures. And, we'll see more of, you having a history in this area, but sort of making light of the fact that, anybody can be, with ingenuity, somebody who can themselves find these devices and then turn them into something productive, right? And so you made these faux YouTube tutorials,
I don't know if it's productive because you're still making something that ultimately you're using to catch and kill a fish, I suppose. But yeah, it depends how you look at it. Yeah.
Well, you're certainly reusing and recycling. But there's also, there's so much going on. Like, people will have to come to the gallery to see the short videos. They're short, they're hilarious. They've got great, like, kind of sort of sea shanty music in the background, and you're set in like the boat with the rope behind you and things like that. Very straightforward in the way you talk directly to the camera to tell your YouTube followers how to learn how to do this. But there are also slow motion shots of you like zooming in on a tampon and things that seem like not maybe the most obvious material that one might use to do something to, have a guy's day out. You also then, go out fishing and they actually work, right? And you're documenting all the stuff you're catching. So I do feel like it's interesting, you're calling this, wasteland fishing. You're actually testing it. It's actually working. You're also doing something it seems like you enjoy with people, you care about. And at the same time, you're really highlighting how extreme the situation is. We talked a little bit about wasteland also, just as a reference point here, which I know wasn't necessarily the basis of what you may have been thinking with the fishing lures and making a like comic video. But I do feel like what stood out to me about that whole project with the lures and with the scrimshaw is, like after World War I, there was something so tragic. The entire, involved part of different hemispheres experienced huge amount of loss, and they felt it immediately. Whereas this other thing that is killing us, like all of these plastics, nobody's really like catching on or paying attention. And so like, I felt like, what do you do except occupy your hands while all of this is happening? So like, I do feel like it was an interesting, I don't know, coincidence, if not direct reference in the project. So let's shift gears a little bit, because I like the way you also combine, like the grand with the disastrous, or like the thing that you find heroic with the thing that you find horrible in a lot of really interesting pieces. So hopefully some people have been able to see, it's a commission at the Four Seasons at One Dalton. I know Kate Chertavian, I saw, was in the comments. So commissioned for the Four Seasons Hotel is this mosaic that you created. And, you were referencing the 1919, like the Great Molasses Flood in Boston. And I'm curious, if you can talk a little bit, about how you heard about it or how you knew about that and how it became a subject of a piece.
Mm-hmm. That's trying to think even where to begin with that. I mean, I guess I should start with the fact that, a lot of the things, people kind of ask me a lot about, the relationship with tattooing and my artwork and how, that the two influenced each other aesthetically. But I think that, to me, one of the ways that the tattooing has really influenced my artwork more is just the kind of intimate exchange that you have with the customer, where you're spending this time alone with this person in a room, and it's, has that sort of same kind of culture of like a barbershop or something like that, where you're just, exchanging like, stories, folklore and whatnot. And, somebody came in and specifically asked me to draw them a tattoo about the Great Molasses Flood, a few years before I did that mosaic. And it was something that I had sort of forgotten about, but, and we started talking about it, and I was, remembering when I was like in 5th grade, and like we would, I would go down to the North End to, buy illegal fireworks from like these, wise guys, like through a, well, I don't need to get into the whole thing, but at any rate, but yeah, I just remember always coming back, and it'd be the hot summer days, and, before the 4th of July, and you'd be buying your fireworks, and you were trying to get back to the station and not get jumped by teenage kids that were older than you and whatnot. And that smell, like sugary smell of molasses, like was like just ingrained in my brain. And the whole idea of like that, that was sort of where the title came from, of like that, they say on a hot day that, you can smell the molasses. But then I think what happened, was then when I was asked to do a piece for Boston, and obviously there's so many, a lot of my work references history, but usually more obscure history and things that are kind of making, critique on, current events and whatnot. And, so there was obviously a bunch of things that I was not paying attention to that are, specifically the things that people think about with history in Boston. But yeah, and it was, that this was around 2018, and the Molasses Flood happened in 1919. And then I started going back and reading about it, and just sort of thinking about all of the parallels to like the time periods of like what was going on then, specifically with like, politics, and how that, this kind of like nativist, like xenophobic culture was being kind of conjured up and, used to manipulate people politically. And then there was this sort of massive deregulation after, due to World War I, that led to this kind of structure that was being built in the North End, that was specifically put there because it was a disenfranchised community, and that this structure was built with like, absolutely no, nobody, regulating it whatsoever as far as safety and whatnot, because of that specific time. And that it was really the, the end of World War I, and that these people were using the, this War Powers Act, like to build this giant thing for molasses that was used for gunpowder production and whatnot. Is that right? I don't know.
Yeah.
But military uses, but they were anticipating the prohibition, which was all of this thing that was coming out of this like religious piety that was happening at the time. And then they were thinking about that way as a way to get rich and make profit, because they were going to hoard the molasses and then make the last amount of grandfathered in alcohol to be produced before alcohol was made illegal. And they were going to make tons of money. And then that's basically what led to this thing
explosion
that killed a whole bunch of people, was basically, deregulation, religious piety, greed, and, and xenophobia. And racism. So then basically after it happened, it was this thing that they, that instead of investigating it properly, they used the you know, that kind of language that was very similar to the way, you know, what was happening here at that time with, you know, like the kind of racist rhetoric around, like, you know, Muslim Americans and whatnot, where they were sort of talking about Italians in that neighborhood as being these people that could never ever be fully American and fit in because they were too different. And then ultimately they ended up, rather than investigating what actually happened, they tried to blame it on, you know, this kind of pseudo, you know, Italian anarchist terrorist groups that they made up that they claimed bombed the, you know, the big molasses vat. So I was just thinking about that and everything that was happening, you know, around that same time, you know, as what, you know, what was happening with the Trump administration and things like that. And then,
and you're sort of crossing times in many ways. It's chronological in the piece, in that you, in the original version that you did for the Four Seasons, you have everything from the Citgo sign, and again, another like energy company, but a symbol of Boston. You've got cars, bicycles, pigeons.
well, the shoes are really like, you know, I mean, there's a lot of shoes in there because I think that, you know, people don't really think about that necessarily when they think about Massachusetts, but Massachusetts was, you know, was
the factories and mold.
You know, that was such an important part of like what this, you know, the industrial culture of the, you know, this whole area was at that point in time, was shoe manufacturing, you know.
Yeah.
And of course, the thing is too that it was, you know, you know, unbeknownst to me at the time, it was, you know, 2019 was like was when the, you know, the influenza was happening, and then
yeah,
course, you know, things repeated themselves again to some degree. It's the time, yeah.
Well, so you made this version, which worked beautifully with the interior, the wooden interior of the space. We have that original, like I have the detail over here of little squirrel in the socks cap, and you also have Kate Squirrel in a drawing that's in the Praise Shadows show, and your like tattoo, you know, that tattoo design of the big vat breaking and destroying the elevated train rails and, you know, the horses and carriages, etc. And then you made a new version that's much more distilled for this installation. And I'll just, you know, move folks through relatively quickly that, you know, that building is pretty iconic. Oh, and there's a great point from Meadow Dibble about the molasses itself coming from the Caribbean, and, you know, that there is a West Indies relationship, and of course, run on enslaved labor.
Something that I feel like, you know, in Boston particularly, they kind of sort of always manage to like downplay that, you know, the involvement and, you know, how, you know, connection to the slave trade and whatnot, you know, is that we were sort of like not really part of it because of this Quaker culture and things like that. But, you know, obviously with the molasses, it definitely was. And that's why I also, you know, yeah.
Even Faneuil Hall was funded, you know, by the slave trade, right? And so we brought forward, you know, there's sort of a before and after, but Faneuil Hall was obviously there in the 1700s, and well, there was a fire, but, you know, by the 1740s, built back better. And, you know, I have this photo on the left from Historic New England of how Faneuil Hall as a kind of historic site fit into the landscape of the city. And then by the 60s, when like whole neighborhoods like the West End, where there were a lot of tenements and a lot of poor people completely displaced to build, you know, City Hall and the towers, et cetera. But I just want to emphasize, you know, the how close and proximate City Hall is, right across the street, you know, that 60s brutalist building right across from Faneuil Hall with its golden cupola and the grasshopper weather vane. And you were the person who told me, I've known about this photograph for years, but I never knew about the link of what else happened, like in 1974 around the Boston housing crisis. So just, you know, I find it interesting that, you know, to tell folks about what you knew about symbolically, what the grasshopper meant, what 1974 meant, what this photo meant to you.
Well, first, I feel like I should say, I think I told you before that when I was a kid, my mom had a vending cart in Faneuil Hall. So like that was a place that I would go to when I was like a little kid, like, like after school, and she would give me and my sister $5 and we'd go to the food court, and I, knew everybody in the whole place and would go around, and it was just like this amazing experience for me to sort of like, I associated it with this kind of like, my first sort of like international thing where it was like this, you could just walk down this thing and see like all these different foods from different places. And that was kind of like this really amazing thing as a, 6-year-old. And, and I remember the grasshopper, on top of Faneuil Hall, and like, and from my understanding, it was like kind of like a welcoming symbol to the city and whatnot. And, and I was thinking about, a lot of when I included in the original mosaic, a lot, kind of as I was saying before, a lot of these are kind of like, hyper realized versions of what actually happened. There was no molasses that came down, like it was a big molasses wave, but it was obviously not sinking Faneuil Hall, But so I was, thinking about that, and I guess I remember reading about it, and that in 1974 the grasshopper was stolen from the top of Faneuil Hall, and then and I had sort of forgotten about that, and I was thinking, obviously like the the whole busing thing was something that was this kind of terrible stain on the city's history of that kind of normally likes to present themselves as like a very progressive place and whatnot. And then I went to one of Hank Willis Thomas's shows in the city, and he had used this photo in one of his pieces, and I just had kind of forgotten about it, and I was just sort of thinking about that and how that was like 1974, and it was also this year that this symbol that I kind of considered like this really, as a child, like this kind of like, very, hopeful, welcoming symbol disappeared. And so I guess I was thinking about those two things at the same time as, this kind of wave was coming through, knocking it down, that I was also associating with the Molasses Flood, and that was so tied into this kind of, really racist manipulation of people during that time period, and then kind of what then again happened in the 70s, and sort of what was happening in the past few years,
like a toxic wave, like in a lot of ways. Like you were describing how even though the theft in 1974 and this famous photograph that it was a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph known as The Soiling of Old Glory, and that's like a high school student who's just so upset that he's being told by the courts in terms of the busing that he has to go and into a segregated classroom instead of going to a school he already went to. That's famously Ted Landsmark, who's still teaching at Northeastern University and is an amazing leader in the city of Boston, who just happened to be turning the corner when this riotous group that was protesting, turned on him. So even though they didn't, it's not a cause and effect relationship, it's interesting how you work with narrative in general to put things together that didn't necessarily go together historically, but in terms of the truth of a true reflection or a true narrative of your experience of the city, do ring true. And I think the title that you chose was really interesting, and sort of the double-sided meaning of enchafed. And can you just talk about why you chose that title for the piece?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that's the thing with like enchafed is a word that, kind of, means like, heated or bothered or infuriated and whatnot. I mean, it can either be, I think, positive or negative. I think that like, obviously with like Auden, they were talking about something more like, conjuring up the romantic spirit of the sea and whatnot. So it was probably more of a positive. I mean, you know, Auden also sort of talks a lot about the space between, you know, the edge of the water and the sea, and how that's sort of a vulnerable space, and that one is a place that is, you know, I think that he's sort of looking at maybe at a different way than I am to some degree, but one as this, you know, what it is, like a space that's, you know, more organized and controlled, and another one that is chaotic and lawless. And yeah, so I think that I guess I was thinking about that, but maybe thinking about more of it as just being like this, you know, wave of destruction, you know. But I mean, I think there's also, you know, environmental, you know, connections to that too, and that, you know, some of the things that he was even talking about back then are sort of about the fragility of that space, and that it can sort of be completely overcome by this much larger and lawless kind of untamable wilderness that's right beyond it, that can destroy at any time, you know. Yeah.
Well, I love these references. I'm going to move us relatively quickly through this next section, because you were talking about both sides of things, right? Like, and Chafed is both, you know, roiled up. It could be passion, it could be inspiration, but it could also be something dangerous and, you know, a two-sided coin. And I feel like you deal with narratives and figures that are always sort of in these in-between positions. They're not one or the other in terms of, you know, the upstanding citizen or, you know, the immoral, but kind of back and forth in between, and definitely resisting black and white boundaries or barriers, right? If it's between sea and land, if it's like in a space of no man's land or not ownership, or going back and forth, like what is or isn't allowed. So these aren't in the show, but I just want to give folks background that you've been playing with these ideas for a very long time in your career. And if many people have read about or followed your Fly By Night project, I was privileged enough to see it in New York. I know you also did it in London. You know, pigeons themselves were in wars used to send messages across enemy lines under the cover of darkness. You know, but you had a really interesting and long-standing relationship with how it is that they could be smart communicators and recognize things, and also you know, set up this whole battleship with coops to see them sort of moving in an abstract way, but still at a site that had historical significance, because there were pigeon coops in the harbor, like off of Brooklyn Navy Yard. And it's interesting also that pigeons, you know, you were thinking about smuggling and how they could also get across barriers that seemed arbitrary. And so this whole series, Smugglers and Filmmakers, that you had done prior, you had these pigeons wearing little harnesses and flying back and forth between Key West and Cuba to see if they could chart that journey and also carry some contraband, some Cohiba cigars. And I just found it amazing that some of your filmmakers, I know Roman Polanski was one of the ones who completed the mission, Mel Gibson, not so much, but you chose filmmakers for names like people who ran in with the law. And that they made it, and you could see made it back to the coop and hung out with the guys who brought the Cohibas. Like, it's pretty phenomenal. And you also were thinking about the contraband, like the smuggling, and some pigeons, like, you know, Pablo Escobar was successful bringing back something to you in Key West. And I'm curious if you can just talk about, you know, I think you think of very interesting ways materially and sculpturally, and also in terms of what is the law of making decisions to meander and navigate around what seem like arbitrary strictures. Can you talk about like these resin pieces and what they were?
Well, that was actually like how I displayed the cigars that were successfully smuggled back. Basically we definitely had, you know, it was one of these things where OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets and Controls, was made aware of the fact that these birds, not me, had smuggled cigars from Havana to Key West, and they weren't happy about it, because they, sort of the New York Times kind of went out of their way to sort of antagonize them and make fun of them about it, because it was, the whole purpose of the project was that, not the whole purpose, but one of the things that I was doing was trying to use this ancient, method of carrying things that had been around since the beginning of civilization to kind of go circumvent the, billions of dollars that were being spent to canvass the Florida Strait and kind of stop this, this kind of very contradictory law. But at any rate, so yeah, I wanted to show the work, but we were still sort of expecting that there could be problems, really, So what I decided to do was to take the cigars in their case, and I engraved each one with what was the which bird it was flown on and whatnot, and then to put it into resin, so that way I could show them in a gallery. There was just a case, in order to determine whether or not there was actually a cigar inside that case, which would be the only actual legal contraband, not the case itself. Mm-hmm. That somebody like the law, whoever it would be, would have to basically smash the case open. So if they were wrong and I had taken the cigar out and it was not inside there when I put the resin in, then naturally they would be responsible for paying for the full price of the artwork. So it was kind of a little bit of a get around. I'm not usually somebody who uses a lot of resin in my work, but in this case it seemed like the right thing to do.
Well, I also pulled out a little detail among the portraits of the pigeons, because you got Pablo Escobar, you got Whitey Bulger, you have Russell Riley, family relation, but many people know Whitey Bulger. And so, that I think you having grown up in the Boston area, having grown up going to the Harborside and Southie or in New Bedford, I think I brought these historical records forward, not you, but of the history of smuggling even in New England, just also in the maritime world. It's one of these things where bringing things in and out of port, there is a way to both deliver things for good and also get around restrictions. And I found this profile on the left of Lou Doucette, who total upstanding citizen, fed the children, helped orphans. Even when he was smuggling and got caught, wanted to insist he didn't get separated from his little terrier, his dog, that he could keep his dog with him, so that there are people doing their job on the liquor spot and people on good sides. And
I think that there's Pierre Lafitte and Pierre and John Lafitte in New Orleans, or pretty much the entire, after they left the Continental Army, the 21st Regiment from Marblehead all became, smugglers during the Revolutionary War and whatnot. And it's, I think it's totally tied into the history of, of the United States, and shaped it without a doubt.
Yeah. And so it seems like you've had a fascination with those characters or those stories where people are working around, you created this one night, in this abandoned space that had been a shanty town, and they could get around. They weren't in New York jurisdiction, so they could get around those laws during Prohibition and, run alcohol. And you took that site and made, a bar for an evening, or, I found it fascinating, with Rotgut, you got around not having a liquor license by people getting memberships, and then could gift them drinks.
Yeah, that was a system that was basically people would come in and they would buy a membership, and that would come with their drinks were cheaper than that. It was 5 complimentary drinks, but the membership cost $20, and then when they drank their 5 complimentary drinks, and their membership expired, and then they had to, re-up their membership and become a member again.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the way that it worked. Yeah. That was something I actually picked up from the Hells Angels. in Providence, Rhode Island. That was how they used to do things over there. So I just did the same thing when but anyways, yeah, that's a story for another day, I guess.
But it's interesting that even then, Randy Kennedy is recognizing this as social practice art, like back in 2006, that you're doing this and you're doing it deliberately and to an end, right? Like, of course, there's something celebratory, there's a party, but there's also a defiance and a pointing to a history of how certain people are trying to control other people's behavior.
Yeah.
I know we're at 7:52 and we can wrap up this section and leave time for questions. And I'm just going to ask folks to put in the chat because I can see the chat. There's a last section where we can talk about some of Duke's connection to Boston and some like of his history growing up, Captain Bob Calhoun, like influences. If folks would like to see that, we can keep going, or put questions in the chat so we can start inserting those into our last few minutes of conversation. I'll just, while folks are doing that, I do feel like it's interesting how you focused on people who maybe were jobless and placeless, like the hobo in your Cleveland project. You made this mosaic and it was shown at MoCA Cleveland. But you also, again, another video and, a performance piece, basically, you actually rode freight trains, right? You did it yourself across the country and then made this film for the show, sort of like an old timey, like silent film, telling again this unsung story of this underknown history of how folks saw Cleveland as sort of the shining city. And yet when they were driven out, people were upset. And, just talk about how you captured this information carved in the Buffalo nickel, like what that kind of handheld folk piece meant at the time.
Well, I guess I should start by saying, sort of saying that when I went to Cleveland, prior to that, most of the projects that I had done were along in coastal towns and where I was kind of making, sort of those same connections that I was talking about before with just that sort of nature with those places and transgressive culture and that connection with the transience of that place. And when I went out there, I was sort of like, I don't even know what I'm going to do and how I'm going to relate to this sort of landlocked place. And then, it was really just kind of like driving around. And then, I sort of found this spot where these railroad tracks met this river that was, kind of a little creek, and was asking somebody about it. They started telling me about this crazy history that was there, that had happened there, that involved all these, itinerant workers. And and it was really when I started to recognize that it was, what I was thinking about was maybe kind of beyond that. It was more about just specifically like how the geography of a space can kind of influence, this kind of like some sort of, transgressive behavior and whatnot. And like there was a railroad track where people would jump off, and then there was a place where they could get water. And then that turned into this encampment that, and so on and so forth. And and then I guess when I was kind of diving into that, thinking about that more, and just sort of how all of these different types of, very transient ways of living and kind of nomadic cultures, regardless of, where they, how old they were and whatnot, were kind of sort of simultaneously being encroached on all over the world, But then I started looking at the hobo culture and whatnot, and how they had this, their own sort of unique iconography and their own folk art and crafts that they would create, which was like the buffalo nickels, which, then it sort of made me realize that it had this direct connection with like scrimshaw, where they were like taking these small objects that they could carry with them and make really intricate little engravings that they could, have in their pockets and whatnot. And then, that sort of also made me realize that there was this whole connection with the song, The Great Rock Candy Mountains and Cleveland, and then how that also was based on an old maritime, sea shanty from way back. And
Yeah.
so this crossover of those two things, Yeah.
Well, I mean, I am like this too. I think we're too similar, Duke, in that I feel like I'm an octopus-like thinker, and I pull in, oh, the association to that with the association of this, and you kind of can weave new connections. Of course, they could hold these in their pockets. The last figure that I was going to talk about, who's featured in your show and in many of the drawings behind you, can't have any pockets, no pockets for these folks. But what we're calling the mermeks, mermen, merwomen, have been these figures that are also sort of landless, nationless, that, obviously have been in nautical imagery for centuries. But, I think you have a new slant on them in your tattoo art, your mosaics, your drawings, and kind of bringing them up to the present as both, doing right or doing wrong, using plastics, collecting, but in ways that I think, it's interesting that they're kind of in between figures. And I do feel like I look at this figure who, like you did for Fly By Night, has the flags and is talking with the pigeons and is on top of, a tenement building as the dirty waters are rising and kind of flooding the most vulnerable parts of the city. I mean, almost like an avatar for you, right? Like thinking of you in your fishing video, and you've got somebody right here. But I like that kind of in-betweenness as a reading of a mer person that I never really had before talking with you. And I'm just curious what your connection is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, kind of basically like you described. I mean, I think that when I think of, I guess I started using them as, when I started drawing those kind of images when I was a kid, growing up, looking at, all the Ralph Calhoun posters in my grandmother's house as a kid, and that, was obviously
like Ralph Calhoun.
Yeah, one of my biggest influences, and, but I think thinking about that, just sort of this idea that, a mermaid or a mermex, is like this kind of genderless, raceless being that exists in folklore in almost every culture in the world. And, it's, if it exists in the ocean, then it's not really tied to any nation or any continent. So it doesn't really exist within any kind of boundaries. But then it's sort of like also in this in-between zone where it's kind of half human and half fish, which, is sort of where we all came from, I guess, but then I don't know. I mean, it just, in a way, it is this transient thing because it doesn't really exist in either place perfectly,
I think, not existing in one place or the other, or having an ambivalent relationship. We are at 8:00, so I want to acknowledge, for those people who have to hop off, feel free. And Ing, if it's okay, because we are recording this, if folks want to see the rest, we can talk through just a little bit more. If folks are able to stay, great, and we'll record it, and then people can reference it later. But I wanted to
I can drink a beer now.
Well, hey, I think you can drink a beer at any time. You're an adult in Boston. But Kate asked a question. Kate Chertavian wanted to know about, she said, the scrimshaws, they seem really personal, super timely with the pandemic, might be part of a huge body of work. What plans do you have for them? And I was curious if you could just say a few words about that.
Can you run that by me again? What was
the scrimshaw pieces,
yeah,
in terms of, what are your plans with them beyond these accumulations in the cabinets and in the cases? I'm thinking of 2022.
Oh yeah, I mean, I guess I am working on them towards a museum show that I have coming up, where I'm going to be exhibiting all of them at once. And and I think in that in that context, I'm sort of thinking about them more, and the idea that we're creating all this stuff and it is going to be around forever, and those will be like the artifacts that future generations will be looking at when they're going through us, our if there's any humans left on the planet at that point in time, and then or maybe it's some other type of being that's evolved you know, maybe it'll be really smart pigeons that are looking at our stuff being like, wow, these people fucked up. But yeah, you know, and just sort of that will be this kind of, you know, conundrum that like, you know, museum, you know, and, you know, archaeologists and whatnot will be dealing with in the future of trying to figure out, you know, what to do with all this stuff and how to, you know, categorize it. So that was sort of the idea of then taking it and putting it back into like, you know, these sort of historical period rooms where all of that stuff is already kind of being, you know,
Yeah.
you know, looked at in that way, you know.
Well, I do think you have a great double awareness of past and present and future at the same time in your work. I'm just gonna, you know, the last few images, you know, we've got this awareness of past and present in the way you use the convention of a sailor's valentine with all the shells for then your contemporary pieces about gentrification in Brooklyn, or, you know, also about your friends, to have and to have not with the project, for, you know, in relation to the Key West videos, back and forth smuggling and filmmaking between Havana and Cuba. And, you know, another really key Boston connection for you is that you know, you were actually working with pigeons as a team, right? Like here, before you even, like when you were in Providence and you met, you know, people who were bouncers and things like that, but you talked about being at the Dorchester group based in Braintree of what is now the Greater Boston Homing Pigeon Concourse. And I think it's just really interesting that, you know, even one of those super early images that you had, like I think you must have been 16 at this point.
That's sort of what happened. Like you got a lot of the right information, but yeah. That I definitely wasn't releasing a pigeon when I drew that picture, but you know, that was definitely you know, Boston, and that was a pigeon, and that was, you know, at night, and that was sort of me, I think, thinking about pigeons at that time when I was in high school and seeing some sort of, you know, I think at that point, you know, I was spending a lot of time hanging out on the street and doing a lot of bad things, but definitely a lot of graffiti, and spending a lot of time wandering around the city alone at night. And I think that, you know, I already had this kind of relationship with pigeons from when I was a kid, you know, where I found a pigeon and took care of it, and then became kind of, you know, obsessed then. But I think later on, I had like a sort of different connection with them, where I was really sort of, I think when you're climbing around the city and going into all these, you know, subway tunnels and abandoned buildings and things like that, you start to look at the landscape differently, and you start to think of it more like, like a landscape, more like a forest or something. And, you know, and you think differently about the animals that inhabit that space, you know, that you're much more, I think, hyper aware of, like raccoons and things like that people don't really see unless they're walking around, you know, relatively shut down Boston at like 4 o'clock in the morning on a, you know, school night. But
well,
anyway, you know, like, yeah.
It's interesting that you saw like the city as a landscape, not broken up as a grid of private and public property. And so even if under the cover of night, you could kind of see the city differently that way. The other thing we talked about was also the water, and like being drawn to the waterfront, or like hanging out along the Charles River, you know, waiting for girls or doing things along the Charles River, et cetera. But that water gave permission to be a little bit more, I don't know, connective. Like, you know, it's sort of like makes everything flow. And I feel like we can just end on, you know, the decision to even name the show Lovers, Muggers, and Thieves, because the song is one, you know, I guess describe your own relationship to it and your choice. But also, you know, what you think is interesting about the song.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what you were kind of saying about the, you know, like the water and everything, like that's sort of the nature of, I think, what a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about generally was that, you know, kind of going back to the transgression line and whatnot, like that, you know, the waterfront in a city was traditionally like the less desirable space, you know, and that's changed a lot in the past 20 years, where now they're building a lot of, you know, condos along the edge of the water, but it was typically like, you know, where they put like the, you know, the public housing. It was where, you know, if you look at Boston, you know, it's like these were like the kind of places where, you know, there was, you know, sex workers had a safe place to go, and there were areas with like, you know, where it was, you know, a safe place for gay cruising, and it was also like where a lot of the, you know, organized crime and sort of smuggling things, that some of that, which I experienced a little bit when I was, you know, helping my uncle out in the fish pier and stuff when I was a kid. And you know, and it was also like, just like me, I think like when I was, you know, a teenager, that was what we did. We'd go down to the, you know, the Charles River and drink beer and, you know, or go to Revere Beach and cruise the strip and stuff like that. And, you know, and that song, I think, you know, had a lot of, you know, kind of referenced all that stuff when they're talking about lovers, muggers, and thieves. But then, you know, I think also the fact that it was just talking about dirty water, and how that is also so much about what I'm talking about with just the environmental aspect of things too, you know. But I mean, I can go into more detail, I guess, but I don't know if it's necessary. You know?
Well, no, I think it's amazing just to land on the fact that you even chose to use, you know, lovers, muggers, and thieves in the Red Sox font as sort of a reference to what brought that song back as sort of an anthem for the city, when it was originally like a very ironic song by a band from LA who wasn't from Boston.
They're actually making fun of the city, really.
They're really making fun of the city, and the guy who wrote the lyrics got mugged in Boston, so he's making fun of the city. And yet,
I don't think they understood that. You know, like that's one of those things that everybody from Boston probably actually just embraced. Anyways, you know, it's sort of I guess.
And so then when the sports teams, only when they won would they play it in Fenway, so people would hear it and know, oh, that's a good sign. And then that led to people actually seeing it as something beloved instead of something kind of ironic. But I think that it's, again, fascinating that you have the slant on our hometown. And I'm so grateful that Praise Shadows could host you for this first home back in your hometown since the 90s. That, you know, you can hold both of those contradictory ideas at the same time, like a love for a place, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement of all of the rough edges, and not just choose an either or, but kind of love it for all aspects of it. So, you know, as a hometown girl, I appreciate the work, but I also appreciate the complex layers and all the narratives that you weave. Are there any last words you want to share before we end the recording, so Ing can go home?
I mean, it's great to be back here, you know.
Yeah. Well, a lot of Boston love for you, Duke. We're really grateful. Hopefully you can hit the Maritime Galleries in the MFA tomorrow and see more.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, definitely.
I'll tell folks that we will make the full PowerPoint available. So if you notice us skipping through a few slides, you'll be able to click on things, and you know, there are hyperlinks there, so you can learn more about a lot of these stories. Duke, thank you so much for your words and for your time.
Taking the time and doing such a, you know, incredible job, you know, investigating and describing my work. Yeah.
A pleasure. You know, I hope, you know, if there were a fly-by-night in Boston, I want to bring it.
Well, I did pitch it to Boston, just for the record. I pitched it to Boston before I pitched it to New York, and they weren't interested, you know.
Well, maybe times can change. If you're willing for a 3
I have plenty of ideas of things that I want to do here. I just need somebody crazy enough to go along with it.
Well, a lot of people are wishing you super well in the chat and hoping you come back and visit them in Jersey and lots of other places. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And Ing, thank you for letting us run over just a little bit. And I hope that the recording works so other folks can enjoy this talk. All right, we're gonna say goodnight. Don't forget to support Pine Street Inn and the homeless with a shirt. And keep following everything that Duke is doing, and Praise Shadow Art at Instagram. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Duke.
Bye. Hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.